In the long stretch of land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, an ancient world took shape. Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, was a place where rivers flooded, where fertile fields spread outward, and where people built some of the earliest cities known to history. The land itself was not gentle. Summers were long and hot, with dry winds that carried dust. Winters could be cold, marked by heavy rains that turned streets to mud. Yet, it was here that people settled, cultivated grain, and raised livestock, forming a society that endured for centuries. Among the many structures that defined life in Mesopotamia, the temples stood above all others. They were built in the center of cities, rising higher than the homes of ordinary people. Some were simple, made of mud bricks, while others grew into massive ziggurats, with tiered levels climbing toward the sky. These temples were not merely places for worship. They were centers of economy, administration, and community life. A temple might hold stores of grain, record debts on clay tablets, or organize labor for the fields. To live near a temple meant to live near the very heart of Mesopotamian society. Religion was not separate from daily existence. It was woven into the rhythm of life. The gods were thought to control everything: rainfall, harvest, fertility, and even illness. If the river flooded, people saw the hand of the gods. If disease spread, it was believed to be divine punishment. To please the gods, offerings had to be made, and rituals had to be observed. The temple stood as the place where the human world and the divine world touched. Priests, priestesses, and temple workers played their roles to maintain this fragile balance. The grandeur of these temples could seem impressive from afar, but inside, life was often marked by strict routines and heavy obligations. Stone courtyards echoed with the sound of chants. Narrow chambers were lit by flickering oil lamps, filling the air with the scent of smoke and the faint odor of animal offerings. The walls, sometimes painted or decorated, gave a sense of sacred order, but they also created a feeling of confinement. The temple was not a space of personal freedom. It was a place where every movement, every task, and every gesture carried weight. For the poor of Mesopotamia, temples were both a blessing and a burden. They offered food during shortages, but they also demanded service and loyalty. Many who could not pay debts with silver or grain had to repay them with labor. Families struggling with poverty often saw the temple as both their protector and their master. Daughters might be given to serve, not always by choice, but because circumstances left no other option. In this way, temples shaped lives in ways that were both profound and permanent. The people believed that their gods required not only offerings of food and incense, but also acts of devotion that included service within the temple itself. For some, this service meant sweeping floors, preparing bread, or caring for sacred animals. For others, especially women, the service could take on a more complex and burdensome role. Within the rituals of certain temples, the practice of sacred prostitution was established, linking sexuality to divine worship. It was not a matter of personal desire. It was framed as an offering to the gods, a duty to the temple, and a way to ensure prosperity for the community. To understand why this practice existed, one must first see how deeply the Mesopotamians believed in the cycle of fertility. The fertility of fields, the fertility of flocks, and the fertility of people were all considered connected. If the land was barren, if crops failed, if families did not grow, it was believed that the gods were displeased. Rituals involving intimacy, performed under the authority of the temple, were seen as a symbolic way to renew the world. In their view, these acts mirrored the divine union of gods and goddesses, a reflection meant to bring life and abundance back to the earth. But behind the religious explanation, there was also the reality of human experience. To live as a woman bound to temple service meant following rules that were strict and unyielding. Days were long, filled with repeated ceremonies and unending duties. Nights could be uncertain, shaped by the demands of rituals that carried both physical and emotional weight. The temple provided shelter, but it did not provide freedom. It gave structure, but it also took away choice. The earliest records describe how entire families could be involved in temple life. Fathers might give daughters not out of malice, but because survival required sacrifice. A family unable to pay debts might see the temple as the only option. In some cases, the arrangement was presented as an honor, but in reality, it was often an act of desperation. For the woman, it meant a life determined by forces outside her control, shaped not by her own wishes, but by the expectations of her community, her family, and her gods. The temple itself was a paradox. On one hand, it was sacred, celebrated, and revered. On the other hand, it was rigid, demanding, and often unforgiving. The walls that rose toward the heavens also closed in on those within. The gods were thought to watch constantly, through the eyes of priests, through the rituals that repeated day after day. To live within this system meant to accept that the divine will came before personal will, that the needs of the gods outweighed the desires of the individual. As Mesopotamian society developed, these temples only grew in importance. Cities like Uruk, and Babylon became famous not only for their palaces, but also for their temples. Ziggurats towered above city walls, visible for miles, reminders of divine power and human devotion. Life revolved around these structures, and to question them was unthinkable. 4 women bound to their service. This meant that their role was not simply local, but part of a vast network of belief that spanned centuries. To begin this journey into the life of a temple prostitute, one must first recognize the weight of the setting itself. Mesopotamia was a land where survival was never easy. Floods destroyed fields. Droughts left people hungry. Disease spread quickly. Every hardship was explained through the will of the gods, and every hope for relief was tied to rituals carried out in the temple. Within this framework, the women who served were seen not as individuals with private lives, but as necessary instruments in the ongoing relationship between humanity and the divine. It is in this world, with its towering ziggurats, its chanting priests, its anxious families, and its endless dependence on the unseen will of the gods, that the life of a temple prostitute took shape. It was not simply a matter of choice or profession. It was a role carved out by history, by faith, and by the heavy burdens of society. To understand why it was so hard to be such a woman in Mesopotamia, one must begin with the weight of the temples themselves. Grand in appearance, central in purpose, but deeply demanding for those who lived within their shadow. In the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, religion was not confined to rituals of prayer or the burning of incense. It touched every aspect of life, from the planting of barley in the fields to the distribution of water through canals, from the writing of laws on clay tablets to the bonds of marriage within a household. Nothing existed outside the reach of the gods. Within this all-encompassing framework, certain practices arose that may appear unusual or even bewildering to the modern mind. Among them was the institution often described as sacred prostitution, a practice that bound sexuality and spirituality together in a way unique to that time and place. The roots of this practice were tied to the Mesopotamian view of fertility. The land was harsh. Fields depended on the river's unpredictable floods, and the survival of families depended on crops that might succeed one year and fail the next. Fertility was not just about children. It was about grain sprouting from the earth, herds multiplying in the fields, and life renewing itself season after season. The gods, it was believed, controlled this fertility. They decided whether the earth would yield abundance or withhold it. For this reason, rituals that symbolized fertility were thought necessary to secure divine favor. One of the central myths of Mesopotamia told of the goddess Inanna, or Ishtar as she came to be known in later texts. She was the goddess of love, fertility, and war, and her union with the shepherd god Dumuzi represented the sacred marriage, the bond between heaven and earth, between divine power and human life. In the temple, This myth was not only recited but acted out. Priests and priestesses conducted ceremonies that symbolized this divine union, believing that by imitating the gods, they could ensure the fertility of the fields and the prosperity of the people. It is within this religious context that sacred prostitution was framed. Women devoted to the temple were seen as representatives of the goddess, embodying her powers of fertility and renewal. Their participation in rituals of intimacy was considered not an act of personal indulgence, but an offering to the gods, a symbolic act that connected the mortal world with the divine. To lie with a woman of the temple was to partake in a sacred act, one that carried spiritual weight and not merely physical pleasure. But behind the grandeur of this religious explanation, the reality was more complex. Women often did not choose this path willingly. Many were given to the temple by families who saw no other way to survive. Poverty, debt, or lack of a dowry could lead parents to dedicate a daughter to temple service. Once within its walls, her identity was transformed. She was no longer simply a daughter, a sister, or a wife in waiting. She became a vessel of divine ritual, bound to duties that would shape her entire life. The rituals themselves varied from city to city and from temple to temple. In some places, the sacred marriage might be performed once a year, a grand festival where the king himself symbolically united with a high priestess representing Inanna. In other contexts, the acts might be more frequent, involving other women tied to the temple, who served as living symbols of fertility. Whether occasional or regular, the underlying idea was the same, that the union of flesh could mirror the union of gods, and that this mirror was necessary to maintain the balance of the world. For the women involved, this meant carrying a role that was both exalted and degrading. On one hand, they were seen as connected to the goddess, their bodies and actions infused with sacred meaning. On the other hand, they bore the burdens of expectation, control, and ritual obligation. They could not freely choose partners or refuse participation. Their lives were directed by the demands of priests, the expectations of worshippers, and the ever-present belief that their service was vital for the prosperity of the community. The Mesopotamians did not separate the sacred and the mundane in the way that modern societies do. For them, the plowing of a field could be an act of devotion, and the exchange of silver could carry divine sanction. In this worldview, sexuality itself was not seen as private, but as a force that belonged to the gods, a force that had to be channeled and controlled through ritual. The temple was the place where this channeling occurred, and the women who served within it were the instruments through which divine power flowed. This intertwining of the sacred and the sexual gave the practice an aura of inevitability. To question it would have been to question the gods themselves. Families who dedicated daughters did so with a mixture of resignation and hope. Resignation that poverty gave them few choices, and hope that by giving to the temple, they secured favor for their household. For the women, however, it meant a future shaped less by personal desire and more by the unyielding structures of tradition and faith. Over time, stories about these practices spread beyond Mesopotamia. Later writers from Greece and Rome told tales of women who were required to sit in temple courtyards, waiting for strangers to approach them as part of ritual obligation. Whether these accounts exaggerated or misunderstood the reality, they added to the image of sacred prostitution as both exotic and harsh. The truth, as with many ancient customs, was more nuanced. Some women may have held positions of respect within the temple hierarchy, while others bore the heavy weight of stigma and loss. What remains clear, however, is that the practice was not a matter of freedom or romance. It was bound up in ritual, in myth, in the unrelenting demands of a society that saw human bodies as instruments of divine will. To be a temple prostitute in Mesopotamia was to live at the intersection of devotion and duty, carrying a burden that few would envy. The concept itself was rooted in belief, But its execution was felt in the daily lives of women whose choices were few and whose obligations were many. As one reflects on this institution, it becomes clear that it was less about individual fulfillment and more about maintaining the order of the world as Mesopotamians understood it. Every ritual, every offering, every symbolic union was part of a cycle that bound people to gods, and gods to the fate of the land. In that cycle, the lives of women in temple service became both central and expendable, honored as sacred, yet consumed by duty. In ancient Mesopotamia, religion was not a private matter. It was not something confined to the heart of a believer or to the quiet corners of personal prayer. Instead, it was woven into every aspect of daily existence. The rising of the sun, the flooding of the rivers, the success of a harvest, the outcome of a battle, all were believed to be determined by the will of the gods. In this world, religion did not only offer comfort or hope, demanded, commanded, and it weighed heavily on those whose lives were bound to its service. For women who were given to the temple as prostitutes, this weight was more than symbolic. It was an ever-present reality that shaped their waking hours, their bodies, and their futures. The obligations placed upon them were not chosen but imposed. A girl might grow up with dreams of marriage or motherhood, only to find that her family's poverty, or a vow made by her parents, had set her apart for temple service. From the moment she entered, she ceased to belong to herself. Her life became the property of the gods, her actions dictated by ritual necessity. The burden of religious obligation began with expectation. A temple prostitute was expected to embody the presence of the goddess, often Inanna or Ishtar, in rituals that symbolized fertility and renewal. This expectation was not light. It carried with it the responsibility of representing divine power in the flesh. To fail, or even to appear unwilling, could be interpreted as an affront to the gods themselves. In a society where misfortune was always attributed to divine displeasure, the pressure to perform faithfully was immense. These women were not permitted the freedom to choose when or how they would serve. Their obligations were laid out in temple law and custom. Certain festivals required their participation. Certain rituals demanded their presence. They might be summoned at dawn for prayers, at midday for offerings, at night for ceremonies meant to mimic the union of divine lovers. The rhythm of their lives was dictated by the calendar of the temple, not by their own desires. The sense of personal identity began to dissolve under this weight. A woman might once have been known for her laughter, for her skill in weaving, or for the stories she told at her family's hearth. But in the temple, those details faded. She became known for her role, for her duty, for her body's place in rituals that reached beyond her. She was seen not as an individual, but as a vessel, a representative of powers greater than herself. This was not a burden shared equally across society. The priests held authority, the kings enjoyed honor, the merchants pursued wealth. Ordinary families struggled, but at least they could claim their lives as their own. The temple prostitutes, however, lived in a space where even their bodies were claimed as offerings. Their obligations reached into the most intimate corners of their existence, leaving little room for private will. Obligation also extended into how they were viewed by others. Worshippers who came to the temple might look at them with awe, seeing in them the touch of the divine. But outside the temple walls, whispers often told another story. To some, they were sacred figures. To others, they were women marked by shame. This dual perception added another layer of weight. They bore not only the duties of ritual, but also the judgments of society, caught between honor and disgrace. The obligations were physical as well as spiritual. The rituals they performed could be exhausting. Long hours of standing, chanting, singing, or preparing offerings were followed by the demands of intimacy presented as sacred duty. The body was pushed to serve the gods in ways that could leave it weary, vulnerable, and drained. Yet refusal was not an option. To refuse was to risk angering the gods, and through them the entire community. Even the act of rest was not entirely their own. The temple might call upon them at unexpected times. Festivals could stretch through the night, with drums and chants echoing through the halls. Their sleep was broken, their energy consumed by obligations that allowed little recovery. In such an environment, exhaustion became a constant companion, a silent burden layered upon the spiritual weight they already carried. The obligations were also lifelong. Unlike some temple servants who might be released after a period of time, many prostitutes remained bound to the temple indefinitely. A girl given at a young age might spend decades within its walls. Her youth, her adulthood, even her old age could all be marked by the same cycle of service. The years passed, but the burden remained. For many, there was no escape, no alternative path waiting beyond the temple gates. Perhaps one of the heaviest burdens was the loss of choice in matters of the heart. Marriage, for most women, offered a chance to build a household, to raise children, to shape a future with a partner. For temple prostitutes, this possibility was often denied. Their bodies were already bound to sacred duty, leaving little room for personal bonds. Some may have longed for love, for the simple joys of partnership and family. But those longings had to be suppressed, buried beneath the demands of obligation. The burden of religious duty was not only heavy, it was unrelenting. It did not lift when festivals ended or rituals concluded. It pressed upon them in silence, in solitude, in the quiet moments when they might wonder what their lives could have been. It was a weight carried not only on their bodies, but also in their minds and spirits. The knowledge that their lives were not their own, that every act was demanded rather than chosen, could be a source of deep and enduring sorrow. Yet society framed this burden as honor. Families might speak proudly of a daughter in temple service. Priests might declare her role essential for the prosperity of the land. Kings might honor the ritual union as a sign of their legitimacy. The community spoke of blessing, while the women lived the weight of obligation. In this contrast lies the tragedy. What was celebrated by others was endured by those who bore it. When we think of these women today, it is tempting to imagine them as merely victims or merely honored priestesses. The truth, however, is that they were both exalted and constrained, both honored and diminished. The burden of religious obligation was a paradox. It raised them in name while lowering them in freedom. It placed divine significance upon their bodies while stripping away their own voice. In the quiet hours of the temple, when the chants had faded and the torches burned low, perhaps some of them sat in silence, feeling the true weight of their duty. A burden invisible to outsiders, but unshakable to those who lived it. The burden of religious obligation was not just a demand of the gods. It was the shaping of a life into something no longer personal, no longer free, but forever bound to the heavy hand of ritual and expectation. Inside the walls of a Mesopotamian temple, life moved according to its own rhythm, one that was steady, repetitive, and deeply tied to ritual. The outside world, with its bustling markets, fields of grain, and constant noise, seemed far away. Within the temple, the day unfolded in a measured sequence of duties, sounds, and expectations. It was a world where every detail carried meaning, and every task, no matter how small, contributed to the larger machinery of religious devotion. The women assigned to temple service woke early, often before the sun had fully risen above the horizon. The cool air of dawn drifted through the courtyards, carrying with it the smell of oil lamps that had burned through the night. Their mornings began not with personal choice, but with obligation. Washing was required first, cleansing the body before entering the sacred spaces of the temple. The water was often drawn from vessels kept within the temple itself, cool and heavy in clay jars. This act of purification was a reminder that their bodies did not belong solely to themselves. They were instruments of ritual, and cleanliness was the first duty of the day. After washing, The women dressed in garments provided by the temple. These were not necessarily fine or beautiful, but they carried symbolic meaning. Linen robes, plain but marked for ritual use, were tied at the waist. Jewelry, when permitted, was often symbolic of divine connection. Every thread, every accessory, carried a role within the temple's language of signs. The act of dressing became a daily reminder. They were not individuals choosing how to present themselves. They were participants in a larger performance, one that required them to embody the temple's identity. The first tasks of the day usually revolved around maintaining the temple itself. Cleaning was constant. Floors of baked brick were swept, altars were wiped down, oil lamps were refilled. Ashes from the previous night's offerings were carefully collected, sometimes buried or carried away in ritual fashion. Nothing could be left in disorder. The gods were believed to inhabit these spaces, and disorder was seen as disrespectful. For the women, this meant long hours of quiet labor, repetitive motions carried out day after day. Food preparation followed. Offerings of bread, fruit, and sometimes meat needed to be readied for the priests and for the rituals. Grain was ground into flour, dough was kneaded, and loaves were baked in clay ovens that radiated heat into the already warm rooms. The women performed these tasks alongside temple servants, their hands moving in rhythm with work that seemed endless. Yet even in these simple actions, ritual meaning was present. Bread was not only food, it was an offering to the gods, a symbol of life and sustenance. Once the temple was prepared, ceremonies began. Priests recited hymns and prayers, filling the air with chants that echoed through the chambers. The women were expected to be present, sometimes singing in response, sometimes standing silently in attendance. Their role was not always active, but it was constant. To stand in silence for long hours, maintaining composure, was itself a duty. The stillness of their posture was seen as a reflection of respect, an offering of the body in quiet service. In certain rituals, their role was more direct. They might participate in dances, slow and deliberate movements meant to imitate myths of creation and fertility. They might pour libations of wine or water at the base of altars, the liquid soaking into the earth as a gift to the gods. In some cases, they served as living symbols of the goddess herself, participating in ceremonies that bound the divine to the human realm. These moments were heavy with expectation, requiring them to suppress any personal feelings and simply embody the role demanded of them. Meals were taken within the temple walls, usually in communal fashion. The food was plain: bread, lentils, dates, and occasionally meat. Eating together reinforced the sense of belonging not to a family, but to a religious household. Conversation was often muted, overshadowed by the awareness that the temple was not a place of relaxation but of duty. Every gesture, even during meals, was expected to remain orderly and respectful. The afternoons were filled with smaller tasks: spinning thread, weaving cloth, preparing incense, polishing vessels. These were daily duties that seemed mundane but were essential to keeping the temple functioning. Incense had to be ground from resins and herbs, mixed carefully so that the smoke rising from altars would please the gods. Vessels had to shine so that they reflected the sacred light of the torches. Even the act of weaving cloth could carry ritual meaning, as textiles were offered to the gods or used to clothe statues of deities. Festivals disrupted the routine with heavier demands. On those days, the women might be called to serve for hours without rest, their tasks ranging from preparing elaborate meals to performing in long ceremonies. Drums and flutes filled the air. Torches burned late into the night, and the women's bodies were called upon in both symbolic and literal ways. Sleep became scarce, and exhaustion was accepted as part of devotion. At night, when the temple gates were finally closed, the women returned to their quarters. These spaces were simple: rooms with mats for sleeping, perhaps small lamps to ward off darkness. Privacy was rare, as many slept side by side. The silence of the temple was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of priests chanting final prayers or the faint rustle of wind through stone corridors. Rest was taken not as leisure but as preparation for another day of duties that would repeat almost exactly as before. The rhythm of temple life erased individuality. Days blurred into one another, defined not by personal milestones but by cycles of ritual and obligation. A woman might spend years within the temple and remember her time not through personal experiences, but through the festivals that mark the calendar. The harvest rituals, the spring celebrations, the ceremonies of renewal. Time became circular rather than linear, trapping her in a cycle that repeated endlessly. The monotony of this life was perhaps its most defining feature. While others in society might measure their days by seasons in the fields or by business in the marketplace, the women of the temple measured theirs by ritual repetition. Every day began and ended with duties, and every duty was layered with meaning that often left little room for personal thought. In this way, the temple walls did not only contain their bodies, they contained their lives, shaping every hour into an act of service. Daily life inside the temple walls was not marked by dramatic events or sudden changes. Instead, it was a slow unfolding of duties, rituals, and expectations that pressed down gently but firmly upon the women who lived there. Each day was quiet but heavy with meaning. Each action was small but demanded. And as the years stretched on, the temple walls seemed less like a place of protection and more like a boundary that defined the limits of their existence. To understand the life of a woman bound to temple service in Mesopotamia, it is necessary to dwell on the slow erosion of personal freedom that defined her existence. Freedom in this context was not simply the ability to walk where one pleased or to speak when one wished, but the deeper freedom of shaping one's own path in life, to choose whether to marry, to decide how to live, to hold ownership over the body and its future. Within the framework of temple life, these choices were steadily stripped away, replaced by obligations dictated by priests, traditions, and the gods themselves. From the very beginning, many of these women did not decide their fates. Often, the path into temple service was arranged by families, who saw the placement of a daughter as both a religious offering and a way to resolve practical matters. For a poor family burdened with debts or lacking the resources to secure a dowry, dedicating a daughter to the temple could seem like both duty and survival. Once the decision was made, her voice carried little weight. What might have been presented as honor, the offering of one's life to divine service, was in reality the removal of choice. The temple became the boundary of her world. While others in society moved through markets, fields, and homes, she moved through courtyards, shrines, and ritual chambers. Permission to leave was rare, and when granted, it was under specific conditions. Even the act of stepping beyond the temple walls did not carry with it true freedom, for she remained bound by her role, her attire marking her as property of the temple. What seemed to the outside world as sacred duty was, for the women inside, a life constrained by rules they did not create. Marriage, which in Mesopotamian society was one of the few recognized avenues of social and personal development for women, was denied or tightly controlled for those in temple service. Some were forbidden from marrying at all, their lives considered consecrated permanently to the gods. Others might have been permitted to leave after years of service, but even then, their choices were limited. They carried with them the stigma of their past, viewed not as individuals but as former servants of ritual, marked by experiences that society did not always respect. For many, the idea of building a family, raising children, or creating a household of their own was an unreachable dream, overshadowed by the obligations imposed at an early age. The loss of personal freedom extended even into the most intimate aspects of life. A woman's body, rather than belonging to herself, was understood as a vessel for ritual. Sexual acts performed under the auspices of sacred duty were not framed as personal choices, but as offerings to the gods. The woman was expected to surrender agency, to accept that her role was defined not by desire or consent but by obligation. To question this structure was unthinkable, for it was upheld by priests, justified by mythology, and reinforced by the ever-present fear of divine disapproval. Daily routines further reinforced this lack of autonomy. Each task was assigned, each movement observed, and each ritual demanded adherence to strict forms. There was little space for spontaneity. To act outside the established pattern was to invite correction, punishment, or exclusion. In such a tightly controlled environment, even small choices, such as how to arrange one's hair or when to rest, were overshadowed by regulations and expectations. Over time, individuality faded, replaced by the identity imposed by the temple. Freedom of thought, too, was restricted by the weight of tradition and belief. To imagine a life beyond the temple was to entertain thoughts that were both forbidden and futile. Education was limited, confined to hymns, rituals, and the myths that supported the temple system. The larger world of ideas, learning, and personal ambition remained closed. What might have been curiosity became resignation, and the quiet acceptance of a life already decided. The emotional burden of this loss of freedom was not expressed openly, for expression itself was restrained. Instead, it lingered quietly, like the steady pressure of stone walls. To wake each morning knowing that one's path had been chosen by others, to lie down each night aware that tomorrow would bring the same obligations, was to live in a cycle that offered no escape. The walls that provided structure and security were also the boundaries that confined. This condition of unfreedom was reinforced by the larger society. The temple system was not seen as oppression, but as sacred order. Families, priests, and rulers accepted it as natural. A woman who questioned her role risked not only punishment within the temple, but also shame upon her family and accusations of impiety. The weight of community expectation pressed as heavily as the dictates of religion, ensuring that her role was not only enforced by rules but also by social necessity. Even in death, the lack of autonomy persisted. Burial practices for temple women often followed prescribed forms, with little regard for personal wishes. Just as their lives were offerings to the gods, so too were their deaths folded into ritual, their individuality once again submerged beneath the needs of tradition. Their names might be recorded, but their stories were absorbed into the collective narrative of the temple, leaving little trace of personal choice behind. In this way, the loss of personal freedom was not a single moment but an ongoing reality. It was present in the decision made by families, in the control exerted by priests, in the rituals that shaped daily life, and in the unspoken acceptance of society. It stripped away the ability to choose, to direct, to shape one's own existence. The women who lived within the temple walls became symbols rather than individuals, their lives guided by patterns not of their making. The story of temple service in Mesopotamia is often framed in terms of sacred duty, divine connection, and ritual importance. Yet beneath these lofty ideas lies the quieter, heavier truth, that the women who lived this life did so without the freedoms that others might take for granted. Their futures were not theirs to decide, their bodies not theirs to claim, and their voices not theirs to raise. They lived in a space where devotion was indistinguishable from control, and where the loss of personal freedom was the defining condition of their existence. In ancient Mesopotamia, life was inseparably bound to the rhythm of survival, and survival depended heavily on the unpredictable fortunes of families. Wealth was rare and poverty was common. Grain might fail to sprout in the fields, livestock might fall ill, and floods or droughts could destroy the fruits of months of labor. In such a world, economic pressures were constant, pressing down on every household with a weight that was inescapable. It was a world where the boundaries of personal choice were often determined not by desire or ambition, but by circumstance, necessity, and the unyielding forces of social expectation. For many families, the question of how to secure a daughter's future was fraught with difficulty. Marriage, which was the traditional path for women to achieve social stability, was often inaccessible. A dowry, a set of goods, money, or property provided by a family, was required to marry a daughter successfully. But for families in poverty, such a dowry was impossible to assemble. Without this guarantee, the daughter's options were limited. Families faced a harsh reality. In order to ensure her survival and maintain social honor, they might dedicate her to the temple. Temple service offered what appeared to be a solution. It provided shelter, sustenance, and a place within a structured environment. A daughter dedicated to the temple could be maintained at the expense of the gods, rather than relying on uncertain marriage arrangements. The family could relieve some of its financial burden, while fulfilling what was considered a sacred duty. To modern eyes, this may seem cruel or unfair, but in the context of Mesopotamian society, it was understood as a practical response to economic necessity, framed within the language of devotion and religious obligation. Debt also played a significant role in pushing women toward temple life. Families who were indebted to local landlords, merchants, or temple authorities often found themselves unable to repay what they owed in silver, grain, or labor. The dedication of a daughter could serve as a form of repayment, a way to satisfy obligations without the need for immediate cash or goods. In this sense, temple service became intertwined with the economic structures of society. Poverty and debt did not simply affect households in abstract ways. They could dictate the very path of a child's life. The social expectations surrounding these decisions were equally influential. Families were judged not only by their wealth, but by their adherence to ritual and custom. Dedication to the temple could be portrayed as an act of piety, enhancing the family's reputation. Conversely, failure to offer a daughter to divine service, when circumstances seemed to demand it, could be seen as neglectful or impious. Social pressure, therefore, reinforced economic pressure, creating a situation in which the family's survival and honor were deeply tied to the decision to place a daughter into service. The young women themselves were often aware, even if only partially, of the forces shaping their lives. A child who grew up in a household burdened by poverty or debt could sense the anxious calculations of parents, the quiet conversations about survival, the weighing of obligations against resources. The reality that her future was being decided by the intersection of economic necessity and social expectation was something she might comprehend, though she had little ability to alter it. The awareness of limited choice added a subtle, constant tension to her existence, a quiet undercurrent that shaped her perception of the world. Temple service was not only a solution for survival, it was also a means of maintaining social order. In a society where resources were scarce and obligations were numerous, every household needed to make decisions that would ensure stability. By dedicating daughters to the temple, families could secure a predictable place for them, while simultaneously contributing to the continuity of religious institutions that structured the larger society. The economic necessity of the family was thus inseparable from the religious and social expectations of the time. Once inside the temple, economic pressures did not disappear. They merely shifted. The women became part of a system in which their labor, their time, and even their bodies were tied to sustaining the temple's operation. Tasks such as preparing food, maintaining the grounds, and participating in rituals were necessary for the survival of the institution. In this way, the economic structure that initially pushed them into service continued to define their lives even after they entered the temple. Poverty had not ended. It had merely been transformed into ritualized labor, internalized and codified within religious practice. The broader community also benefited from this arrangement. By placing daughters in temple service, families helped maintain a workforce that supported the religious economy. The temple, in turn, could continue to provide services, perform rituals, and maintain its influence. Women's lives, while constrained, were integrated into a system that appeared orderly and beneficial on a larger scale. The personal loss of freedom, the sacrifice of potential alternative futures, was absorbed into a network of social and economic stability that few questioned. Even for families who were not impoverished, social expectations could enforce temple dedication. A family wishing to display piety, loyalty to the gods, or compliance with custom might voluntarily dedicate a daughter. Here, the economic burden might be less pressing, but the social pressure was still formidable. The balance between personal desire, family duty, and societal expectation created a complex web of obligations, each one layering onto the life of the young woman who ultimately had the least control. Thus, the intersection of economic pressures and social expectations formed a persistent, quiet force. It shaped decisions long before the daughter entered the temple and continued to define her life after she arrived. Every day, the influence of poverty, debt, and custom was evident in the work she performed, the rituals she participated in, and the limitations imposed upon her freedom. The economic realities of her family, combined with the expectations of society, ensured that her life followed a path predetermined by circumstances beyond her control. The women in temple service were caught in a delicate and unyielding balance. They were a solution to economic necessity, a symbol of social expectation, and instruments of religious ritual. The convergence of these pressures created a life that, while framed as sacred, was profoundly constrained. Every act, every moment, and every choice, or lack thereof, was shaped by the unrelenting weight of economic and social forces, leaving little room for personal freedom, desire, or escape. Life within the temple walls of Mesopotamia was not only constrained by duty, ritual, and social expectation. It was also defined by a quiet, constant strain, both physical and emotional, that wore steadily on the women who served there. Their bodies, tasked with the repetitive demands of daily labor, ritual performance, and occasional sexual rites, endured a slow accumulation of fatigue that could scarcely be alleviated. Each day brought a sequence of duties, from the moment of awakening before dawn until the last hours of night, leaving little opportunity for rest or recovery. The physical labor required of temple women was diverse but never-ending. They swept and cleaned the temple floors, maintaining the sacred spaces to exacting standards. Ash from burnt offerings had to be removed carefully, and every vessel, statue, and altar needed attention. Oil lamps required refilling, incense needed grinding, and grain had to be prepared for offerings. Each task might seem small in isolation, yet repeated continuously, day after day, they became an unrelenting load on muscles, joints, and stamina. Even minor injuries or aches could not be indulged, for the rituals demanded presence and precision. Movement within the temple was measured and deliberate. Dances or ceremonial gestures required a steady rhythm and careful attention, demanding physical coordination and endurance. These movements, though slow and ritualized, were sustained over long hours, often under the watchful eyes of priests and supervisors. To falter, to lose composure, or to move incorrectly could be interpreted as disrespect, imperfection, or even failure. The constant awareness of observation amplified the strain, as each motion had to be both accurate and graceful, leaving no room for fatigue or error. Sleep itself was a luxury compromised by expectation. Nighttime rituals, festivals, or offerings might extend long after the sun had set, and the schedule of the temple dictated that women rise early the following morning. In their quarters, often simple rooms with mats or low beds, rest was fragmented. The rhythm of daily life allowed little time for uninterrupted sleep, and the cycle of exhaustion compounded slowly, shaping their physical state over months and years. Their bodies, weary from labor and ritual, endured constant pressure, with rest always provisional and insufficient. Emotional strain accompanied the physical. The weight of responsibility pressed silently, constantly reminding the women of the boundaries of their existence. Their lives were framed by obligations not of their choosing, and the absence of autonomy created a persistent undercurrent of tension. Every decision, from minor acts of self-care to participation in rituals, was dictated by authority. Their sense of personal agency was diminished, leaving a subtle but unrelenting strain on their mental and emotional well-being. The emotional toll extended to relationships as well. Bonds with family, when maintained, were often complicated by the distance imposed by temple life. Interaction with peers inside the temple was circumscribed by hierarchy, ritual, and supervision. Intimacy, in the conventional sense, was rare, and moments of personal connection were constrained by duty. Loneliness could seep quietly into even the busiest days, as the women navigated a world structured more around obligation than companionship. The rituals themselves could be a source of both physical and emotional pressure. Sexual rites performed as part of sacred ceremonies were not acts of personal choice but duties imposed by tradition and authority. Participation required not only the body but also a steadying of the mind, a suppression of personal desire or discomfort. The act, though framed as sacred, could be emotionally taxing, layering another dimension of strain onto an already demanding day. Seasonal festivals increased the intensity of the work. Preparations for celebrations required long hours of effort. Food needed cooking, garments had to be cleaned or crafted, and spaces had to be meticulously arranged. During the festivals, ceremonies extended late into the night, often requiring women to remain active for hours without respite. Exhaustion accumulated, compounded by the ceremonial expectation of constant composure and focus. The physical demands were intertwined with the emotional pressure of performing correctly in sacred contexts, creating a combined strain that rarely abated. The environment itself contributed to the burden. Temples were often crowded and echoing, with stone walls that retained heat in the summer and cold in the winter. Air could be heavy with the scent of incense, oil, and food, and corridors were narrow, requiring careful navigation while carrying offerings or implements. The sensory demands of the temple were subtle but persistent. The constant presence of others, the expectation of reverence, and the ambient atmosphere all contributed to a quiet, accumulating pressure. Over time, the strain left marks that were both visible and invisible. Physically, long hours of labor and ritual could weaken the body, creating fatigue that rested deeply in muscles and bones. Emotionally, the pressure of obligation, lack of choice, and continuous expectation could create a persistent tension, a low hum of anxiety that never fully dissipated. The women's lives were a continuous balancing act, maintaining composure and function under conditions that demanded unceasing effort. Even small interruptions could carry stress. Illness, minor injuries, or fatigue did not excuse the fulfillment of duties. The temple's needs were paramount, and the collective operation of rituals and offerings depended on every participant maintaining her role. Emotional resilience became as necessary as physical endurance, as the mind adjusted to accept the ongoing burden as ordinary, expected, and immutable. The monotony of the strain compounded its weight. Unlike sudden or dramatic hardships, the daily pressures of temple life were continuous and predictable, creating a slow, pervasive impact. The combination of repetitive labor, ritual expectation, and emotional suppression became almost invisible, yet in their cumulative effect, they shaped the body and mind of every woman in service. The quiet constancy of the burden made it persistent, intimate, and inescapable. In the end, the physical and emotional strain of temple life was a defining feature of existence for these women. It was not marked by singular crises but by the accumulation of small, unrelenting pressures. It was a burden woven into the fabric of every day, carried quietly yet profoundly. Each step, each gesture, each moment of compliance contributed to a life framed by service, discipline, and expectation. Over years and decades, the weight of this strain became inseparable from the rhythm of life itself, shaping the experience of every woman within the temple walls. Life within the walls of a Mesopotamian temple carried not only the weight of ritual and duty, but also a constant, quiet risk to the body's health. The women who lived there were subjected to conditions that were rarely forgiving, and the challenges of maintaining hygiene and avoiding illness were persistent, daily concerns. Medical knowledge was limited, treatments were rudimentary, and the environment itself could become a breeding ground for minor ailments that, left unchecked, could turn serious. Water was essential for survival, but access to clean water was often complicated. While the temple maintained vessels and storage for water, the supply was limited, and its quality depended on careful management. Contamination could occur easily, and the women's bodies, constantly in contact with soil, grain, and ritual materials, were exposed to pathogens that might go unnoticed. Washing, though ritualized and frequent, could not always prevent illness. The water used for purification was not always hygienically safe, and the tools and containers employed were themselves potential sources of infection. Living quarters within the temple, though providing shelter, were often crowded and shared. Mats or low beds were arranged in close proximity, creating conditions where lice, fleas, or other parasites could spread without interruption. The presence of multiple occupants in confined spaces, combined with limited ventilation, contributed to the transmission of minor but persistent health problems. Skin irritations, rashes, and sores could arise from these conditions, and without proper remedies, discomfort lingered. Food, while sufficient for sustenance, carried its own risks. Grain, bread, and preserved foods were staples, but improper storage or contamination could lead to digestive disturbances. Spoilage was a constant concern, particularly in warmer months, and the women had little control over the quality or handling of their meals. Illness could be exacerbated by these dietary risks, compounding the strain already imposed by labor and ritual obligations. Medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. The treatments available were limited to basic herbs, poultices, and ritualized interventions. While some knowledge of healing plants existed, their effectiveness was variable, and the women had little autonomy in deciding when or how to apply remedies. Minor wounds, infections, or illnesses could escalate quietly, and the temple's medical care was often reactive rather than preventive. The combination of limited knowledge and restricted access meant that even common ailments could persist and worsen over time. Menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth presented additional challenges. The women were expected to continue fulfilling their duties even during periods of physical vulnerability. Menstrual hygiene was managed with rudimentary materials, and the discomfort of these cycles was endured quietly, often without accommodation. Pregnancy, for those permitted to conceive, could be fraught with risk, as nutrition, physical strain, and the lack of medical support compounded the potential for complications. Childbirth was perilous, and the survival of both mother and child was uncertain. Ritual and duty did not pause for these biological realities. The women were expected to maintain their roles regardless of physical condition. Emotional strain interacted subtly with physical health. Stress, anxiety, and exhaustion weakened the body's defenses, making minor infections or fatigue more pronounced. The constant expectation to perform perfectly in rituals and duties meant that complaints of illness were often suppressed or overlooked. The psychological burden of knowing that one's health could not interfere with the needs of the temple contributed to a persistent, low-grade tension that amplified physical vulnerability. The risk of contagious diseases was ever present. Respiratory infections could spread through shared spaces, and exposure to the elements during travel to nearby markets, water sources, or ritual sites could introduce further pathogens. Temple architecture, though protective, could trap heat in summer or retain cold in winter, creating conditions that stressed the body. Damp floors, cold stone walls, and limited bedding could aggravate fatigue, rheumatism, and respiratory ailments. Preventive measures were minimal and often symbolic. Ritual purification, washing, and the use of incense were thought to ward off spiritual or physical contamination, But these acts were insufficient against the realities of microbial exposure. The women's understanding of illness was framed by tradition, superstition, and observation, rather than systematic knowledge. The slow progression of disease could go unnoticed until symptoms became severe, and even then, remedies were limited. Long-term consequences of these conditions were cumulative. Chronic fatigue, minor injuries, untreated infections, and stress-related ailments built gradually, leaving bodies worn and sometimes deformed by repetitive labor. The combination of poor nutrition, constant activity, and limited healthcare created a subtle but persistent deterioration over years of service. The temple, while providing shelter and sustenance, could not prevent the slow toll that the daily conditions exacted on the women's bodies. In essence, the health and hygiene challenges of temple life were never dramatic or immediately catastrophic, but they were relentless. Minor discomforts, repeated day after day, month after month, created a quiet weight that pressed on the body and mind alike. The women moved through their lives in a state of persistent vigilance, attending to ritual, labor, and duty while navigating the subtle hazards that surrounded them. Each day was survived, but the survival carried with it small, accumulative strains that few outside the temple could observe or understand. Even as the rituals were performed, the duties fulfilled, and the temple functioned as a place of worship and devotion, the physical realities persisted quietly. Wounds could fester, infections could spread, exhaustion could deepen. These challenges, often invisible to observers, formed a slow but constant current running beneath the rhythm of temple life. The women endured day after day, a delicate balance between devotion, duty, and the persistent vulnerabilities of the body. In the quiet accumulation of minor strains, in the repetition of small tasks, and in the slow passage of years, the health and hygiene challenges of temple life left their mark. They were not dramatic, sudden, or sensational. They were persistent, subtle, and unrelenting. And in this, they contributed to the steady, almost imperceptible burden that defined the existence of women in temple service, a weight carried silently within the walls that contained their daily lives. The lives of women serving in the temples of Mesopotamia were marked by a quiet contradiction, a double identity that defined much of their existence. Within the temple walls, they were revered, respected, and even considered sacred. Their role in ritual and ceremony granted them a form of honor, a recognition that their presence and actions were vital to the functioning of divine service. Yet outside these walls, the perception was often starkly different. Society, in its broader scope, viewed them with suspicion, judgment, or disdain. This dual perception shaped their existence, creating a slow, persistent tension that influenced daily life in subtle but profound ways. Within the temple, women were trained, guided, and given responsibilities that elevated their status among the temple hierarchy. They participated in ritual dances, prepared offerings, tended to sacred objects, and learned hymns and chants integral to religious practice. Each act was imbued with significance. In these moments, they were not simply laborers or servants. They were intermediaries between the mortal and the divine. Their actions were observed by priests and fellow attendants with a level of respect rarely afforded to women outside the sacred space. This acknowledgement, though structured and ritualized, provided a sense of purpose and a framework in which their lives were considered meaningful. Yet this sacred status existed in isolation. Beyond the temple, women who served in religious rites were often subject to societal misunderstanding. Their association with sexual ritual, even if framed as sacred, could lead to perceptions of immorality or impropriety. While the temple celebrated their service, the outside world might view it as transgression. The duality of being both honored and marginalized created a complex social reality, one in which recognition and stigma coexisted quietly, almost invisibly, shaping the women's sense of self. The double identity was reinforced by the everyday interactions with the broader community. When temple women ventured to marketplaces, interacted with families, or attended communal events, they were seen through a lens of ambiguity. Some recognized the sacred nature of their role and treated them with respect, offering deference or acknowledging their contribution to ritual life. Others, however, could not separate the idea of sacred service from notions of impropriety, interpreting their role through narrow moral judgments. The women navigated these mixed perceptions carefully, aware that every gesture, every movement, could be scrutinized or misinterpreted. This dual perception extended into personal relationships. Friendships, familial bonds, and potential romantic connections were complicated by the social stigma associated with temple service. Even those within their immediate family might experience tension or ambivalence, balancing pride in the daughter's service with concern for how others might perceive her. Emotional intimacy was, therefore, delicate and fraught. A woman in temple service lived under the subtle pressure of managing not only her own understanding of her role but also the expectations, judgments, and assumptions of others. The psychological implications of this double identity were slow and pervasive. Living simultaneously in realms of respect and disdain created a steady, underlying tension. The women learned to suppress frustration, to navigate social interactions with care, and to internalize the contradictions of their status. This internalization, subtle and gradual, became a defining feature of their mental and emotional landscape. They moved through daily life balancing the honor of sacred service with a quiet awareness that parts of society judged them harshly or unfairly. Ceremonial life and public ritual offered both relief and reinforcement of this duality. In the temple, their actions were celebrated, and their presence deemed essential. Outside, even minor exposure to the community could evoke whispers, sideways glances, or quiet exclusion. The women learned to compartmentalize their experiences, carrying the acknowledgement of sacred duty alongside the persistent awareness of societal judgment. This compartmentalization, while adaptive, added another layer to the slow, accumulating strain of temple life. Education and skill within the temple could amplify this contrast. Women were trained in music, chant, ritual etiquette, and symbolic knowledge that elevated their status internally. Yet these very skills could underscore their separation from the outside world. Competence in ritual did not translate to social acceptance in broader society. The sacred expertise that defined them within the temple could highlight their perceived difference, reinforcing the quiet isolation imposed by the duality of identity. Even as they moved through years of service, the double identity remained constant. The rituals, the labor, the sacred responsibilities, all served as markers of honor within the temple. Meanwhile, social judgment, misunderstanding, and occasional exclusion persisted outside. This duality was neither dramatic nor violent. It was subtle, quiet, and unrelenting. It shaped the women's perceptions of themselves, their sense of belonging, and the emotional tone of their lives. The long-term effect of the double identity was cumulative. Over time, the women became adept at navigating the quiet contradictions of their existence. Awareness of both respect and stigma informed their choices, their interactions, and their understanding of personal limits. The tension was ever-present but internalized, creating a landscape of calm endurance rather than overt rebellion. Their lives were a study in quiet adaptation, a continuous balancing act between two often incompatible realities. In this way, the stigma of double identity did not emerge from any single event or interaction. It was a persistent, pervasive force, woven into the daily experience of temple life. It shaped movements, speech, emotions, and self-perception, becoming an invisible, enduring aspect of existence. The women who carried this dual identity moved through a world in which honor and judgment were intertwined, each moment of sacred service shadowed by the quiet awareness of societal scrutiny. Ultimately, the duality of identity, respected within the temple, judged or shunned outside, was a defining characteristic of life in service. It was not marked by overt drama or sudden crisis, but by the slow, unceasing accumulation of subtle pressures. In every act of ritual, every labor performed, and every interaction beyond the temple walls, this duality persisted, shaping the rhythm of life and the inner landscape of the women who inhabited this quietly complex existence. In Mesopotamian society, the presence of the gods was woven into every aspect of life, forming a framework that defined morality, duty, and destiny. For the women serving within temple walls, this divine framework provided both structure and justification for their existence, offering a slow, pervasive explanation for the limitations placed upon them. Their lives, constrained by ritual, labor, and expectation, were framed as being guided and determined by divine will. The gods, in this worldview, were not distant observers but active arbiters whose favor or disfavor could shape the course of a life, and whose decrees were interpreted as reasons for obedience, submission, and acceptance of one's circumstances. The temple itself was considered a sacred space, a physical and symbolic embodiment of divine presence. Within its walls, every action was performed with the implicit understanding that the gods were watching, guiding, and judging. This understanding permeated the daily existence of temple women. Their tasks, whether mundane or ceremonial, were not simply duties assigned by human authorities. They were offerings to the divine, acts of devotion that linked labor, obedience, and religious significance. The slow repetition of these duties, day after day, reinforced a belief that their constrained lives were part of a larger cosmic order, a rhythm dictated by divine intelligence. Divine justification was invoked not only to explain obedience, but also to alleviate the potential discomfort of limited freedom. When a woman's choices were constrained by the expectations of the temple or the authority of priests, she was encouraged to see these constraints as a reflection of the God's will. The rituals themselves, the assigned duties, and even the limitations on personal autonomy were framed as sacred, a divine prescription rather than an arbitrary imposition. This subtle framing provided a context in which suffering, restriction, and labor could be interpreted as necessary and meaningful. The gods were also believed to reward obedience and devotion. Success in ritual performance, the smooth execution of duties, and adherence to the temple's expectations were seen as signs of divine favor. Conversely, errors, omissions, or perceived failures were attributed to misfortune, divine displeasure, or personal spiritual inadequacy. In this way, the gods became both the justification for the life of service and the mechanism through which behavior was regulated. The women internalized this understanding, shaping their actions, thoughts, and emotional responses according to a perceived divine standard. Education and training within the temple emphasized the divine nature of obligations. Hymns, chants, and mythological narratives conveyed stories in which mortals served gods, adhered to strict rules, and experienced both reward and consequence. These narratives reinforced the notion that submission to authority, endurance of labor, and acceptance of one's position were not merely social expectations but sacred imperatives. The repetition of these lessons, slowly and rhythmically over time, made the connection between human action and divine will almost seamless. Divine authority also served to mitigate questioning or resistance. The women's lack of personal freedom, their labor, and their participation in ritualized sexual acts could all be rationalized within the framework of divine command. To challenge the structure of temple life was, implicitly, to challenge the gods themselves. This knowledge created a quiet but pervasive internalization of duty. The slow, unrelenting weight of divine justification shaped their understanding of what was necessary, proper, and inevitable. It fostered a calm acceptance, a recognition that life's limitations were part of a cosmic design rather than arbitrary cruelty. The influence of the gods extended beyond the temple. Families and the wider society also invoked divine will in their interpretation of temple service. Parents saw the dedication of a daughter not only as practical or necessary but as a fulfillment of divine expectation. Community members understood temple women as conduits of sacred power, entrusted with responsibilities that reflected the god's will. The dual acknowledgement, both within and outside the temple, reinforced the legitimacy of the women's constrained lives, embedding the divine justification into every layer of experience. The slow accumulation of ritual, repetition, and observation created a rhythm of life aligned with perceived divine intent. Daily actions, sweeping, cleaning, chanting, preparing offerings, and performing ceremonial tasks, were all interpreted through the lens of sacred service. This interpretation was quiet and cumulative. Each day, each task, each act of compliance reinforced the belief that their constrained lives were meaningful within a larger spiritual framework. Over years, this understanding became internalized, forming the subtle but persistent backdrop to every moment of existence. Even discomfort, fatigue, or suffering could be framed in divine terms. A long day of ritual, the exhaustion from physical labor, or the strain of emotional burden could be understood as trials imposed by the gods to test endurance, loyalty, or devotion. Illness, minor injury, or misfortune might be rationalized as lessons, warnings, or the consequences of cosmic balance. In this way, both positive and negative experiences were absorbed into a continuous narrative of divine influence, creating a pervasive sense of order in an otherwise constrained life. This slow, ongoing alignment of daily life with divine will-shaped identity. The women gradually internalized the understanding that their bodies, actions, and emotions were instruments of sacred purpose. Their personal desires and ambitions were subordinated to ritual duty, framed as secondary to the expectations of gods who demanded attention, compliance, and reverence. This internalization was neither sudden nor dramatic. It was quiet, cumulative, and deeply embedded in the rhythm of life. In essence, the role of the gods in justifying the fate of temple women was both subtle and comprehensive. It provided a framework in which restriction, labor, and limited autonomy could be interpreted as meaningful and necessary. It established an internalized order, aligning physical, emotional, and social dimensions of life with divine expectation. The slow, pervasive effect of this divine justification reinforced endurance, compliance, and acceptance, ensuring that temple service continued without resistance, quietly shaping lives within a rhythm that was simultaneously sacred and constraining. Over time, this alignment became inseparable from daily existence. The women's understanding of themselves, their place in the temple, and their relationship to the wider society was mediated through the lens of divine will. It shaped the perception of suffering, the interpretation of duty, and the acceptance of limitation. Through this lens, each day of labor, each ritual act, and each sacrifice of personal freedom was not only necessary but sanctified. Their lives, measured slowly and deliberately, were rendered coherent and ordered by the unyielding influence of gods whose presence, though unseen, was quietly inescapable. The lives of women within the Mesopotamian temple were defined not only by duty, labor, and ritual, but also by a quiet, persistent solitude that shaped much of their emotional existence. Loneliness, in its subtle yet pervasive form, was woven into the fabric of daily life. Removed from the immediate care of family, living in the confined space of the temple, and constantly observed within the hierarchy of service, these women experienced an emotional landscape defined by absence, restraint, and silent endurance. Separation from family was often the first and most immediate source of loneliness. Many women entered temple service at a young age, leaving behind parents, siblings, and familiar surroundings. The choice was rarely voluntary. Economic pressures, lack of dowry, or societal expectation frequently dictated the circumstances. The distance from loved ones, both physical and emotional, created a quiet, persistent ache, a slow undercurrent of longing that could not be easily assuaged. Letters, messages, or visits were rare, and the continuity of family life moved forward with only occasional and brief contact. Over months and years, the absence of daily familial connection contributed to a subtle, accumulating emotional weight, shaping the perception of home, belonging, and security. Companionship within the temple, though available in limited form, carried its own constraints. Relationships with peers were circumscribed by hierarchy, ritual, and expectation. Friendships could develop, but they were often cautious, monitored, or framed by necessity rather than free choice. Shared labor, chanting, and performance offered moments of connection, yet the same environment that enabled these bonds also limited their depth. Trust had to be tempered with awareness of surveillance and social rules, and the intimacy necessary for true emotional relief was rarely available. In this quiet balance, companionship existed but was restrained, creating a slow, ongoing tension between desire for connection and the practical reality of temple life. Emotional burdens extended beyond loneliness. The constant demand for ritual precision, obedience, and compliance created a mental load that interacted with the underlying solitude. Women had to suppress personal desires, control emotional responses, and maintain composure regardless of internal strain. Minor frustrations, sadness, or discomfort were internalized, rather than expressed, creating a continuous, slow accumulation of psychological tension. The mind, aware of the persistent limitations of choice, adapted to manage emotions quietly, often through a process of disciplined suppression. The quiet weight of isolation was also reinforced by the nature of duties performed. Ritual dances, offerings, and ceremonial gestures required focused attention, leaving little mental space for personal reflection or emotional expression. The repetitive, structured nature of work, while providing rhythm, also imposed a form of mental confinement. Emotions could not spill outward. There was neither the time nor the freedom to express sadness, longing, or discontent. Instead, these feelings were folded inward, becoming a hidden current that ran alongside daily activity. In addition to isolation, the women faced subtle forms of psychological tension arising from observation and hierarchy. Each action, movement, or performance was evaluated by priests and supervisors, creating a slow, constant awareness of being watched. Emotional expression had to be carefully managed. Laughter, grief, or frustration could be constrained, suppressed, or reshaped to conform to expectation. The combination of loneliness and emotional surveillance reinforced a sense of quiet restraint, leaving few opportunities for genuine release. Seasonal events, festivals, or ritual gatherings, while providing brief moments of engagement, did not entirely relieve emotional burdens. During these periods, women were surrounded by others, yet social interaction was structured and purposeful. Opportunities for personal conversation, laughter, or mutual support were interwoven with expectation, performance, and duty. Even shared experiences, while temporarily alleviating isolation, were framed within the structure of obligation, reinforcing the subtle tension between presence and private emotional experience. Sleep and private moments offered limited reprieve. In their quarters, women might briefly encounter quiet solitude or moments of reflection, but the environment of the temple allowed little true privacy. Shared rooms, narrow spaces, and the ongoing rhythm of temple life constrained even these moments. Emotional release, if achieved, was temporary and carefully contained. The slow accumulation of longing, frustration, and unexpressed thought continued quietly, shaping both perception and experience. The consequences of sustained emotional burden were cumulative. Over months and years, the quiet weight of loneliness could influence mental health, emotional resilience, and social perspective. The women developed coping mechanisms, often subtle and internal, to navigate this persistent strain. Meditation, ritual repetition, and disciplined focus on duty became tools not only for spiritual practice but also for managing the constant undercurrent of solitude and unspoken emotional tension. Even within ritual and sacred duty, the isolation persisted. The duality of being respected within the temple and simultaneously constrained by structure created a slow, almost imperceptible tension. Emotional needs were acknowledged in principle but rarely addressed in practice. The women's understanding of connection, intimacy, and comfort was shaped by absence, creating a landscape in which resilience was quiet, adaptive, and largely self-contained. Ultimately, loneliness and emotional burdens were defining elements of temple life. They were not dramatic crises or sudden hardships, but slow, persistent pressures that wove themselves into the rhythm of existence. Daily life, ritual participation, and social interaction were all conducted against the quiet backdrop of absence, restraint, and unexpressed longing. Over time, the women internalized this emotional landscape, developing a calm endurance that became inseparable from the rhythm of temple service. In the steady, measured passage of days, months, and years, the quiet weight of loneliness shaped thought, perception, and identity. It existed not as an acute sensation but as a continuous, nearly imperceptible presence. In every task performed, every ritual enacted, and every moment of silence, the emotional burden was carried, subtle yet persistent, forming an intrinsic aspect of life within the temple. This slow, cumulative presence defined the inner world of the women, coloring the rhythm of daily life with a quiet, enduring reality of solitude. Life within the temple was guided by a framework of rules, expectations, and hierarchical authority, a structure that defined every action, movement, and thought of the women who lived there. This structure, slow and deliberate, was enforced not only through instruction but also through the ever-present awareness of possible punishment. The danger of penalty was never dramatic or sudden in the daily rhythm, but it was constant, pervasive, and quietly influential, shaping behavior, self-perception, and the subtle cadence of temple life. Authority in the temple existed in multiple forms. Priests, supervisors, and senior attendants oversaw the daily performance of duties, ritual practice, and adherence to behavioral norms. Their presence was both instructional and evaluative, a steady influence that guided the women through repetition, correction, and expectation. The hierarchy was clear and maintained meticulously, with every minor action observed and measured against a standard that was both procedural and moral. The slow accumulation of minor corrections and instructions created a quiet, pervasive understanding of order and control, reminding the women of the boundaries within which they were permitted to act. Punishment, while not always physically harsh, was psychologically subtle and enduring. Mistakes in ritual, lapses in labor, or deviations from protocol could be met with admonishment, increased supervision, or reassignment of duties. These corrective measures were structured to maintain adherence without overt confrontation. The women internalized the potential for such consequences, moving carefully through each task with measured attention, aware that small errors might result in quiet, cumulative disapproval. The effect of this constant oversight was slow but profound, shaping movements, gestures, and even thoughts, embedding restraint into the rhythm of life. Physical punishment, though not as common as correction or reassignment, existed within the framework of authority. Minor corporal measures, ritualized disciplinary acts, or temporary restrictions were employed to reinforce obedience. The awareness of these possibilities created a steady undercurrent of caution. Actions were performed deliberately, movements were measured, and speech was moderated. The psychological influence of knowing that misstep could lead to consequence reinforced discipline, even in the absence of overt force. Religious justification intertwined seamlessly with authority and potential punishment. Disobedience, failure, or perceived laziness was not interpreted solely as human error. It was often framed as an indication of spiritual weakness, a lack of devotion, or disfavor from the gods. This framework extended the reach of authority into the internal world, merging external oversight with self-regulation. Women learned to monitor not only actions but intentions, aligning behavior with a perceived moral and sacred standard. The slow, persistent awareness of divine and institutional evaluation created a continuous, low-grade tension that influenced thought, emotion, and behavior simultaneously. The danger of punishment extended beyond the temple walls. In a society where social status, family reputation, and communal perception were intertwined with ritual and sacred service, deviation from expected behavior could result in social censure, exclusion, or diminished standing. Families might face subtle social pressure, and the women themselves could experience whispered judgment or limited opportunities for external engagement. This quiet network of observation, both within and beyond the temple, created an extended landscape of authority, where consequences were cumulative and continuous rather than abrupt. Psychologically, the constant awareness of potential correction shaped internal rhythms. Every movement, every performance, and every gesture became an act of quiet calculation. The women adapted to the persistent possibility of correction, internalizing standards and expectations in a slow, almost imperceptible conditioning process. Over time, self-discipline and attentiveness became habitual, merging with ritual and duty to form a continuous pattern of deliberate, careful action. Even minor infractions could accumulate into greater scrutiny. A missed chore, an incomplete offering, or a misaligned chant could draw attention, leading to increased oversight. The cumulative effect of small mistakes, gently corrected but continuously monitored, created a quiet pressure that was steady and unrelenting. The women learned to anticipate scrutiny, to preempt possible error, and to structure their lives around the invisible but persistent presence of authority. The psychological weight of authority and the potential for punishment was slow, quiet, and unrelenting. It was not a dramatic or overtly violent force. It was subtle, measured, and continuous. The rhythm of daily life was interwoven with the awareness of evaluation, creating a constant undercurrent of vigilance. The women moved, acted, and thought in alignment with standards that were externally imposed yet internalized over time, shaping the subtle cadence of every day. Over months and years, this system of authority created a framework of disciplined endurance. The women became attuned to minor cues, small signs of disapproval, and subtle changes in expectation. Their existence was framed by careful observation, moderate restraint, and quiet adaptation. The slow, cumulative presence of authority shaped the mental and emotional landscape as much as the physical routines of labor and ritual. Ultimately, the danger of punishment and authority was not marked by sudden crisis but by gradual, persistent influence. It shaped every movement, every gesture, and every thought, quietly reinforcing adherence to the temple's structure. The women, aware of both divine and institutional oversight, moved through their lives in a rhythm of careful endurance, navigating each day with deliberate attention to expectation, control, and the subtle, unceasing presence of authority. The lives of women in Mesopotamia were defined by a variety of roles, each accompanied by its own routines, expectations, and burdens. Within households, families, and communities, women labored, nurtured, and navigated social constraints. Wives, mothers, and laborers each faced hardships, often subtle and accumulative, marked by the demands of survival, social expectation, and the practicalities of daily life. Yet within the temple, women serving as sacred prostitutes experienced a set of unique pressures, a rhythm of life and labor that differed in form and intensity, quietly setting them apart from their peers outside the temple walls. Wives in Mesopotamia managed households, oversaw domestic tasks, and bore responsibility for the organization and provision of family life. Daily work included preparing food, maintaining living spaces, spinning fibers, weaving textiles, and supervising children. These tasks, though structured and repetitive, were within a context of family support and social connection. Women had roles defined by expectation, certainly, but also by relationships, shared responsibility, and the potential for negotiation within the domestic sphere. Even when labor was strenuous, it was intertwined with social and familial networks, offering subtle reinforcement of purpose and recognition. Mothers faced overlapping challenges, combining domestic work with childcare, education, and the nurturing of family lines. Their responsibilities were enduring and cyclical, tied to the rhythms of reproduction and care. Yet within this role, emotional connection, intimacy, and influence provided avenues for resilience. Bonds with children, shared experience with other family members, and social acknowledgement of maternal contribution created a framework that, while taxing, offered recognition and relational depth. The burdens were cumulative and demanding, but they were interlaced with relational and social reinforcement. Laborers, women who worked in agriculture, markets, or crafts, encountered physical exertion, exposure to the elements, and reliance on skill and endurance. Their work demanded repetitive effort, often with limited reward or recognition. Yet even in these circumstances, laborers could participate in social networks, form alliances, and exercise limited agency in decisions of movement, trade, and interaction. Hardship was present, but it was tempered by communal bonds and practical engagement with the world beyond institutional authority. For women in temple service, the situation was both similar and uniquely distinct. The daily rhythms of labor, ritual, and repetition mirrored aspects of domestic and laboring life, yet the context imposed unique pressures. Within the temple, every action was regulated by hierarchical authority, ritual expectation, and the perceived will of the gods. Work was not defined by negotiation or domestic need, but by sacred obligation and ritual precision. The repetition, though structured and predictable, was intensified by the expectation that it must be perfect, continuous, and fully aligned with divine and institutional standards. Unlike wives or mothers, temple women were largely separated from family networks. The absence of familial intimacy created an enduring emotional burden. Where domestic and maternal roles offered relational reinforcement, temple life imposed isolation. Friendship was possible but constrained, and affection or support had to navigate a framework of surveillance, hierarchy, and ritual expectation. This emotional isolation, combined with physical labor, created a persistent, accumulative strain that was distinctive in form and intensity. The sexualized nature of temple duties also created a difference in societal perception. While domestic and laboring women might be subject to social judgment, the combination of ritualized sexual service and sacred duty rendered temple women both honored and stigmatized. Within the temple, actions were sanctified. Outside, they were misunderstood or morally questioned. This duality was absent in domestic, maternal, or general laboring roles. Wives and mothers operated within socially recognized frameworks. Temple women navigated the delicate balance of sacredness and marginalization. Economic pressure also distinguished temple service. Poverty, debt, or lack of dowry often dictated entry into temple life, creating a pathway defined by necessity rather than choice. While other women faced economic burdens, temple women's livelihoods were directly tied to a hierarchical system of authority and sacred obligation. The dependence on institutional structures, rather than family or community labor, created a subtle but persistent vulnerability, both practical and social. Health and hygiene burdens, too, were intensified in temple life. Domestic and laboring women experienced physical strain and exposure to disease, but temple women lived in an environment where oversight, repetitive ritual, and isolation combined with inadequate medical knowledge to create slow, cumulative physical and psychological stress. Tasks performed in close proximity, shared sleeping quarters, and ritualized sexual service imposed risks unique to the temple context, amplifying the quiet endurance required for survival. The psychological impact of these combined factors was also unique. The dual identity, the persistent observation, the alignment of every action with divine will, and the isolation from familial and social networks created a continuous mental rhythm of vigilance. While wives, mothers, and laborers faced challenges, temple women experienced a compounded, subtle pressure that shaped not only their actions but also the inner life of thought, reflection, and emotion. Even social recognition functioned differently. Whereas domestic and laboring women received acknowledgement within family or community networks, temple women's acknowledgement was bounded, ritualized, and circumscribed by sacred and institutional authority. Public approval was partial, complex, and often contradictory, leaving women to navigate the subtle tension of being simultaneously honored and marginalized. In essence, temple women carried burdens that were both overlapping with and distinct from the experiences of other women. They endured labor, ritual, and economic constraint, as did domestic and working women. Yet the additional layers of sacred expectation, hierarchical control, social ambivalence, isolation, and dual identity created a form of life that was uniquely structured, subtly demanding, and quietly taxing over time. The slow, cumulative effects of these unique burdens were profound. They shaped daily movement, emotional perception, and internalized identity. Temple service, while offering structure, purpose, and ritualized honor, imposed pressures that were distinct from familial, domestic, or laboring roles. Over years, the rhythm of this existence formed a persistent, nearly imperceptible weight, a defining cadence of life within the temple, quietly differentiating it from the lives of women who remained in households, markets, or fields. In this measured and enduring sense, comparisons between roles highlight the singularity of temple life. The hardships faced by wives, mothers, and laborers were real and cumulative, yet the particular combination of ritual, observation, isolation, dual perception, and sacred obligation rendered the burdens of temple women uniquely complex. Their existence was both structured and constrained, defined by duties, authority, and divine will, unfolding slowly, quietly, and persistently over time. As the long days of service in the temple slowly accumulated into weeks, months, and years, the rhythm of life for these women became deeply entwined with both sacred duty and quiet hardship. Every task performed, every ritual observed, and every moment of endurance contributed to a life structured by expectation, devotion, and ritual obligation. The slow, cumulative weight of labor, supervision, and divine oversight created an existence that was simultaneously meaningful and burdensome, sacred yet quietly tragic. The repetition of action, the relentless passage of days, and the continuity of routine reinforced a sense of inevitability, framing life within a slow, deliberate cadence that left little room for deviation. The sacredness of their work was undeniable. Within the temple, each gesture, chant, and offering was connected to the gods. The women's lives were not merely the product of human authority or societal pressure. They were understood as living embodiments of divine will. This framework, carefully maintained over time, provided structure and meaning. Yet the sacred nature of this labor did not diminish its cost. Hours, days, and years passed in a measured rhythm of expectation, performance, and compliance, often at the expense of personal freedom, emotional connection, and the possibility of self-directed choice. The duality of this experience, honored yet constrained, formed the quiet foundation of life within the temple. The monotony of daily existence reinforced the subtle tragedy. Rituals, choreographed movements, and ceremonial duties repeated with minimal variation, creating a slow, continuous cycle. Each day mirrored the last in its structure and expectation. While the sacredness provided context, the repetition itself induced a quiet weight, a mental and physical strain that accumulated imperceptibly over time. The women learned to endure, to accept, and to persist within the steady rhythm of this carefully regulated life, internalizing both devotion and resignation as part of their identity. Isolation remained a constant undercurrent. Removed from family, community, and broader social networks, the women experienced a quiet solitude that shaped thought, emotion, and perspective. Relationships within the temple were constrained by hierarchy, surveillance, and duty. Companionship, when it existed, was moderated by necessity and expectation. Emotional expression was restrained, managed, or suppressed to conform to ritual and social norms. This persistent solitude, combined with the demands of sacred service, created a continuous mental rhythm in which endurance and silent acceptance became central to survival. Authority, supervision, and potential for correction permeated the tempo of life. Priests, supervisors, and senior attendants observed, instructed, and evaluated, ensuring that every act conformed to ritual and institutional standards. Minor mistakes, lapses in attention, or deviations from protocol could result in quiet reprimands, reassignment of duties, or increased oversight. Physical punishment was rare but possible, and the awareness of consequences for error shaped every movement, every task, and every thought. Over time, this slow, unrelenting presence of authority became internalized, guiding behavior, shaping identity, and quietly reinforcing the rhythm of obedience. The duality of perception, both revered within the temple and misunderstood outside, added a subtle complexity to daily existence. Temple women were honored as instruments of sacred service, yet their roles carried social ambiguity and marginalization. This duality contributed to an enduring tension, a slow accumulation of awareness that identity was defined by both veneration and quiet judgment. The external gaze, though often distant, reinforced internal discipline, subtly shaping self-perception and emotional adaptation over time. Physical and emotional strain persisted in tandem. Laborious tasks, ritualized movement, and repetitive performance intersected with a quiet burden of isolation, surveillance, and constrained choice. Over years, these factors produced a rhythm of life that was both structured and restrictive, sacred and exacting. Endurance became habitual, resilience quietly developed, and the slow accumulation of experience reinforced the acceptance of limitation as a central aspect of daily existence. Even moments of minor relief, occasional laughter, shared duties, or brief rituals of communal recognition were carefully contained within the structure of temple life. Joy was present but muted, fleeting, and often subsumed by the ongoing demands of labor, ritual, and expectation. These small instances of relief did not negate the pervasive rhythm of constraint. They were gentle interruptions in a continuous flow of measured responsibility, reinforcing endurance while offering subtle, temporary reprieve. Reflection on this life reveals a profound combination of endurance, purpose, and quiet sorrow. Each day, framed by ritual, hierarchy, and divine will, contributed to an overarching narrative of devotion intertwined with limitation. The slow passage of time, the accumulation of tasks, and the persistence of oversight shaped existence into a continuous flow of measured, deliberate experience. The sacredness of service was inseparable from the cost it imposed, and the quiet tragedy of constrained freedom was ever present beneath the surface of ritual and obedience. The mental and emotional landscape of these women was similarly shaped by slow accumulation. Thoughts, reflections, and feelings were filtered through the lens of expectation, supervision, and sacred duty. Desire for personal agency, connection, or respite was tempered by the reality of ritualized existence. Over months and years, endurance became second nature. Quiet resignation developed into habit, and the rhythm of life formed a consistent, unbroken cadence. In the end, the existence of temple women was defined by a unique balance of sacred purpose and subtle tragedy. It was neither dramatic nor sudden, but slow, pervasive, and cumulative. The sacred framework offered meaning, context, and direction, while the weight of labor, supervision, isolation, and expectation provided the quiet, ongoing burden that defined daily life. Both elements, honor and hardship, intertwined, shaping perception, behavior, and identity with deliberate subtlety. As time moved forward, days folded into nights, rituals repeated, and duties persisted. The rhythm of life carried the women steadily toward a slow, deliberate conclusion each day. Their lives, measured in repetition, endurance, and sacred service, became a quiet testament to the intertwining of devotion and limitation. The enduring pattern of existence, shaped by divine expectation, hierarchical oversight, emotional isolation, and persistent labor, formed a slow, steady cadence that, while challenging, was deeply ingrained in the rhythm of daily life. In this measured and enduring sense, the life of a temple woman was both sacred and tragic. It was defined by ritual, labor, and devotion, Yet it was constrained by isolation, hierarchy, and subtle burdens. The cumulative effect of these conditions created a quiet, persistent rhythm, guiding thought, action, and perception in a slow, deliberate manner. It was a life in which endurance, purpose, and resignation flowed together in unbroken continuity, each day merging imperceptibly into the next, carrying with it the gentle, constant weight of both devotion and quiet sorrow.